The painful truth most people learn too late. What if the person hurting you is not confused about what they are doing at all? What if the sleepless nights, the second guessing, the endless replaying of conversations, the quiet ache in your chest after every interaction, are not happening because you are too sensitive, too emotional, or too broken to handle conflict? What if they are happening because you are trying to have a human relationship with someone who experiences relationships as power? That is the kind of truth that does not just sting. It rearranges you. Because most people walk into painful relationships believing the problem is communication. They think, if I explain it better, if I stay calm, if I choose the right words, if I am patient, if I show enough love, if I keep my dignity, if I stop reacting, if I react more honestly, if I finally tell the full truth, maybe this person will understand me. Maybe this person will soften. Maybe this person will see what this is doing to me. And for a long time, that hope feels noble. It feels loving. It feels mature. It feels like the kind of thing good people do. But sometimes that hope is the very thing that keeps you trapped. Because the most painful truth most people learn too late is this: you may be trying to fix a connection that the other person never entered for connection in the first place. They entered it for control. For validation. For supply. For emotional advantage. For the comfort of being the center of gravity in someone else's mind. And once you see that, really see it, something inside you goes very still. Not peaceful. Not yet. Just still. Because suddenly the chaos starts making a terrifying kind of sense. That is what happened to Maya in Chicago. On the outside, her life looked solid. She was capable, thoughtful, respected at work, the kind of woman people described as grounded. The kind of woman who always seemed to know what to say when someone else was having a hard day. But there was one relationship in her life that made her doubt herself in ways she never admitted out loud. It was with Daniel, someone she had to keep dealing with regularly, someone polished and intelligent enough to make everyone else think he was reasonable, and subtle enough that the damage almost never left visible bruises. That was the part that made it so hard to explain. Nothing was obvious enough. Nothing was dramatic enough. Nothing looked bad enough from the outside. But Maya was slowly coming apart on the inside. A conversation with Daniel could leave her feeling as if the floor had shifted under her feet. She would walk in with a simple concern and walk out carrying shame. She would ask a practical question and somehow end up defending her tone, her memory, her motives, her timing, her sensitivity, her entire character. She kept telling herself it was stress. A misunderstanding. A rough season. A communication gap. Something fixable. But deep down, her body knew before her mind was ready to admit it. The tightness in her shoulders before she saw his name on her screen. The heaviness in her stomach before meetings. The exhaustion after interactions that, on paper, looked completely normal. The strange loneliness of being in a dynamic where the other person could always explain why you were the problem, while you slowly lost the words for what was happening. And that is where so many people live for far too long. Not in obvious destruction, but in invisible erosion. That is why this subject hits so deeply. It is not always the screaming fight that breaks you first. Sometimes it is the constant distortion. The drip, drip, drip of being misread, dismissed, baited, blamed, managed, or emotionally cornered until your own reality starts to feel slippery in your hands. You begin to wonder whether you are overreacting. You begin to censor yourself before they can criticize you. You begin to spend more energy preparing for interactions than actually living your life. You begin to confuse survival with love. And maybe the most heartbreaking part of all is this: many of the people who get trapped in these dynamics are not weak people. They are often the strongest people in the room. They are empathetic, conscientious, reflective. They are the ones willing to look at themselves, to own their mistakes, to have hard conversations, to stay open, to work on things. In healthy relationships, those qualities are beautiful. In narcissistic dynamics, those same qualities can become points of entry. Because if you are the kind of person who believes in repair, you will keep trying to repair. If you are the kind of person who believes in fairness, you will keep expecting fairness. If you are the kind of person who believes love can heal, you may stay far too long in places where love is used as leverage instead of shared as care. That is why this conversation matters so much. Not to make you cynical. Not to make you cold. But to wake you up before you lose more of yourself trying to win warmth from someone who only comes alive when they control the emotional temperature in the room. And before we go any further, if this kind of content speaks to something you have lived, subscribe to the channel and support the work here. That support genuinely helps the channel keep going and keeps these conversations alive for the people who need them most. If you want more honest, emotionally sharp videos that help you see these patterns clearly and protect your peace, hit subscribe now. Here is what Maya eventually realized, and it changed everything. The problem was not that she had failed to explain herself well enough. The problem was that she kept bringing sincerity into a system that rewarded confusion. She kept expecting a shared emotional reality from someone who seemed to experience vulnerability as weakness and understanding as surrender. That is a devastating realization. Because it means the answer is not one more conversation. Not one more perfect explanation. Not one more chance for them to finally get it. It means the very framework you have been using may be wrong. Imagine showing up to play chess, only to discover the other person is not trying to win by the rules. They are waiting for the moment you lean in, invested and sincere, so they can flip the board and then ask why you are so upset. That is what interacting with a narcissistic person can feel like. You are trying to solve the problem. They are trying to own the atmosphere in which the problem exists. And that difference changes everything. Because once you understand that, you stop asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, how do I finally make them understand me? The better question is, why am I still measuring the relationship by my intentions when the damage is coming from theirs? That question is unsettling. It is not comfortable. It will not wrap around your heart like a warm blanket. It is the kind of question that cuts through fantasy. It exposes how much pain can come not only from another person's behavior, but from our refusal to accept what their behavior has been showing us all along. This is where clarity often begins. And clarity, in the beginning, can feel like grief. Grief for the relationship you thought you had. Grief for the version of them you kept hoping would arrive. Grief for the years spent over-explaining, over-giving, overthinking. Grief for how often you blamed yourself just to preserve hope. But grief is not always the end of something. Sometimes it is the first honest sign that illusion is losing its grip on you. Maya did not become free the moment she understood all this. But she became harder to fool. Harder to hook. Harder to pull into endless emotional loops. She began to see that her exhaustion was not proof she was failing. It was proof she had been trying to build connection in a place where connection was never safe. That was the beginning of her strength. And maybe that is the beginning of yours too. Because if you have been living in this kind of confusion, I want you to hear this clearly: your pain is real, even if other people cannot see it. The toll on your body is real. The self-doubt is real. The emotional whiplash is real. But it is not proof that you are weak. It may be proof that you have been standing in a psychological storm, trying to reason with the wind. And in the rest of this journey, we are going to talk about the 4 vital rules that can change everything when you have to interact with a narcissistic person. Not theory. Not cold advice. Real rules that can help you protect your energy, steady your mind, and stop losing yourself inside dynamics that were never built to honor your heart. Before we move on, here is a quick question for you. What hurts more in a narcissistic dynamic? A. The cruel things they say. B. The fact that you keep hoping they will become the person who would never say them. Comment A or B below. Rule 1. Stop expecting emotional fairness from someone who survives by controlling the emotional climate. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that happens when you finally realize you have been bringing a fairness-based heart into a power-based relationship. Not just love. Not just patience. Not just hope. Fairness. The belief that if you stay calm, the other person will calm down too. The belief that if you are honest, honesty will matter. The belief that if you acknowledge their feelings, they will eventually acknowledge yours. The belief that if you are respectful, if you are measured, if you are willing to look at yourself, then somewhere inside the conflict there will still be a shared desire to arrive at something true. That belief runs deep in decent people. It is part of how they move through the world. It is part of what makes them trustworthy, thoughtful, and capable of real intimacy. But when you bring that expectation into a relationship with a narcissistic person, it can become one of the most expensive assumptions you ever make. Because emotional fairness is only possible when both people care more about reality than control. And that is the part many people do not understand until they are already exhausted. Maya did not understand it at first either. She kept approaching Daniel as though they were standing on the same emotional ground. That was the hidden mistake beneath almost every painful exchange. She thought the problem was tension, misunderstanding, bad timing, stress. She thought maybe he was defensive, maybe she was tired, maybe both of them were getting lost in the pressure of life. She kept assuming that underneath the friction, there was still some basic shared commitment to truth and fairness. So she kept showing up accordingly. She explained herself carefully. She softened her tone. She chose her words with care. She tried not to escalate. She tried to be fair even when she felt hurt. She gave context. She gave second chances. She gave the benefit of the doubt so many times it began to feel less like generosity and more like self-erasure. And every time, she walked away with the same invisible bruise. Not because Daniel was always openly explosive. That would have been easier to name. It was subtler than that. He could sound rational while being deeply unfair. He could be composed while quietly reshaping the emotional atmosphere until Maya was the one defending herself. He could dodge the point, shift the focus, question her tone, imply bad intent, and somehow leave her holding the emotional burden for an interaction he had tilted from the beginning. That is one of the most disorienting things about people who survive by controlling the emotional climate. They do not always need to win the argument itself. They only need to control the conditions under which the argument is felt. If they can make you feel too emotional, they gain altitude. If they can make you feel guilty for bringing something up, they regain the upper hand. If they can move the conversation away from what they did and into how you reacted, they have already changed the weather. And once the weather changes, fairness disappears. That is why Rule 1 matters so much. Stop expecting emotional fairness from someone who survives by controlling the emotional climate. This does not mean they never say fair-sounding things. In fact, many narcissistic people are very skilled at sounding fair. They may use the language of maturity, respect, decency, communication, family, loyalty, even healing. They may know exactly how to frame themselves as the calmer one, the more reasonable one, the more balanced one. But words that imitate fairness are not the same as a soul that values it. A person can speak in the grammar of empathy while being empty of empathy in practice. A person can talk about honesty while punishing you for telling the truth. A person can use the language of love while treating your vulnerability like a negotiating weakness. That is why so many good people get stuck. They are not responding only to behavior. They are responding to the possibility hidden inside the behavior. They are listening for signs that the other person is finally about to understand, finally about to soften, finally about to meet them in the middle. They keep hoping the next conversation will be different because they are still relating not only to what is happening, but to what could happen if the other person ever chose genuine emotional responsibility. But that hope becomes dangerous when it repeatedly asks you to stand in the same fire and call it a lesson in patience. Maya began to see this one winter evening in Chicago after a conversation with Daniel that left her feeling hollow in a way she could no longer explain away. She had brought up something small, something reasonable, something that in a healthy dynamic would have led to a calm exchange. Instead, within minutes, she felt herself getting pulled off center. The topic shifted. Her tone became the issue. Her timing became the issue. Her emotionality became the issue. By the end of it, the original concern was barely visible, and she was left with that familiar ache: how did I end up here again? That question haunted her because it was the right question asked too late. The better question would have been, why do I keep expecting a fair emotional process from someone who keeps turning process into power? That shift changes everything. Because when you stop expecting fairness, you stop being surprised by manipulation dressed as misunderstanding. You stop entering each interaction with your heart uncovered. You stop assuming that sincerity will necessarily be met with sincerity. You stop treating every conversation as an opportunity for mutual repair when the other person experiences repair as a loss of control. This is not bitterness. It is not cruelty. It is not becoming hard. It is becoming awake. There is a grief in that awakening, of course. There is no use pretending otherwise. To release the expectation of fairness is to mourn more than one thing at once. You mourn the relationship you thought you were participating in. You mourn the fantasy that the next heartfelt conversation might finally unlock something human and tender in them. You mourn the part of yourself that kept trying to earn basic emotional decency through patience, excellence, restraint, or love. And perhaps most painfully, you mourn the illusion that if you just behaved well enough, wisely enough, kindly enough, you could protect yourself from being mistreated. That illusion is deeply seductive because it offers a false sense of control. It whispers, maybe if I say it better. Maybe if I react less. Maybe if I care more. Maybe if I stop being so hurt. Maybe if I can become even more reasonable, this will finally become a reasonable relationship. But reason does not transform a system built around emotional dominance. It only makes the reasonable person more tired. Daniel did not need Maya to be wrong in every detail. He only needed to keep her slightly off balance. Slightly unsure. Slightly eager to explain herself. Slightly invested in proving that she was fair, kind, rational, trustworthy. That is often enough. Because once you are busy proving your goodness, you are no longer fully evaluating theirs. That is why one of the deepest acts of self-protection is to stop measuring the relationship by your own intentions. Your intentions may be loving. Your values may be clean. Your efforts may be genuine. But if the dynamic keeps leaving you diminished, confused, guilty, or emotionally cornered, then your goodness is not changing the rules of the interaction. It may simply be what keeps you vulnerable inside it. At some point, Maya realized that fairness had become the emotional currency she kept spending in a country where it held no value. She was trying to pay for peace with honesty, trying to buy resolution with self-reflection, trying to earn emotional safety through restraint. But Daniel was not truly transacting in those currencies. He was transacting in leverage, positioning, perception, advantage. Once she saw that, she did not become cold. She became precise. She stopped entering difficult conversations hungry for understanding. She stopped expecting emotional symmetry. She stopped assuming that because something was obvious to a healthy mind, it would matter to a defensive one. She began to understand that the goal was no longer to be perfectly fair in the hope that fairness would return to her. The goal was to protect her center in interactions where emotional imbalance had become part of the structure. That is a different kind of strength. A quieter one. Less dramatic, more costly, more real. And if you are listening to this and recognizing yourself, here is the truth that may save you years of pain: the moment you stop expecting emotional fairness from someone organized around control, you do not lose your humanity. You recover your judgment. You stop confusing your values with the nature of the relationship. You stop assuming that because you would never do this to someone, they must eventually feel the weight of doing it to you. You stop presenting your heart in a courtroom where the verdict was decided before you walked in. And in that moment, something extraordinary begins. Not peace all at once. Not closure overnight. But clarity. And clarity is often the first real mercy. Rule 2, learn to respond strategically, not emotionally. There is a moment in every narcissistic dynamic when you realize that being right is not the same as being safe. That realization changes the way you respond. Up to that point, most people are still trying to win on the level of truth. They think the goal is to explain better, defend more clearly, correct the lie faster, push back more firmly, finally say the one sentence that will make the other person stop twisting reality. But when you are dealing with someone like Daniel, the interaction is rarely happening only on the level of content. It is happening on the level of energy, activation, timing, and emotional control. The facts matter to Maya. The emotional leverage matters to him. And that is why learning to respond strategically, not emotionally, becomes such a vital rule. Not because emotion is bad. Not because hurt should be silenced. Not because you are supposed to become robotic, detached, or empty. But because when someone knows how to use your emotional reaction as both fuel and evidence, your first instinct can become the very thing that deepens the trap. This is one of the hardest truths for good, honest people to accept. When you are hurt unfairly, your reaction feels sacred. It feels like proof that you care, proof that your boundaries matter, proof that something real just happened. And in healthy relationships, emotional honesty can absolutely lead to repair. A sincere reaction can soften the other person, open a deeper conversation, and bring both people closer to what is true. But in a narcissistic dynamic, emotional honesty is often not received as an invitation to connect. It is received as material. Material to shape the moment. Material to redirect the conversation. Material to use against you later. Material to confirm that they still know how to get inside your nervous system. That is why Maya kept walking away from certain conversations with Daniel feeling as though she had somehow lost twice. First, she was hurt by what happened. Then, when she reacted, her reaction itself became the new focus. The original issue would vanish into the background, and suddenly the story was about her tone, her intensity, her sensitivity, her inability to let things go, her supposed overreaction. She was no longer discussing what had been done. She was defending how she responded to what had been done. That is the pivot point where so many people get trapped. They think they are fighting for truth, but they are actually being pulled into a second conversation designed to drain them. And once that pattern becomes clear, strategy stops being cold and starts becoming compassionate. It becomes a way of protecting your own mind from being recruited into a script that was never written for your well-being. Strategic responding begins with understanding something very simple and very profound: your body reacts before your wisdom speaks. Before you even form a sentence, your chest tightens. Your stomach drops. Your thoughts race ahead trying to gather evidence, language, context, self-protection. Your pulse changes. Your muscles brace. The old urge rises immediately: explain, correct, justify, defend. In those moments, it can feel as though not responding quickly would be weak. But often the strongest move is the one that interrupts urgency. Because urgency is where many narcissistic dynamics become most dangerous. If Daniel could get Maya to respond in the first wave of pain, he could often get the interaction onto his preferred terrain. Fast. Chaotic. Reactive. Slightly off-center. He did not need her to become completely unhinged. He only needed her just reactive enough that he could reposition himself as calm, superior, or unfairly attacked. That is why strategy starts with one quiet discipline: do not let your first surge become your final answer. The first surge is honest, but it is rarely wise. It is the inner flash of injury. It is the nervous system saying, "This is not fair." It is your body trying to protect you. But if you speak straight from that surge with someone committed to control, you often hand them exactly what they need most: access to your activation. Maya began to learn this not in some dramatic breakthrough, but in small, almost invisible moments. A comment from Daniel that would normally have pulled her into immediate explanation. A subtle jab that would once have made her defend her motives. A cool, polished distortion that used to make her rush to set the record straight. She started experimenting with something that felt unnatural at first. She paused. Not forever. Not as punishment. Not as a performance. Just long enough to let her body stop leading the conversation. That pause became a kind of inner doorway. On one side was reflex. On the other side was choice. And choice changed everything. Because once Maya paused, she could begin asking better questions. Not, how do I make him understand? Not, how do I prove this isn't true? But, what outcome actually serves me here? That question is everything. It takes you out of the fantasy of perfect resolution and places you back inside reality. Sometimes the real outcome is not to be understood. Sometimes the real outcome is simply to avoid being pulled into an unnecessary spiral. Sometimes the goal is to keep the interaction brief. Sometimes it is to protect your credibility. Sometimes it is to save your emotional energy for a part of life that can actually give something back. This is why strategic responding is not about suppressing emotion. It is about directing energy. It is about refusing to spend $10 of life force on a 2-cent provocation. It is about recognizing that not every statement deserves engagement, not every accusation deserves defense, and not every emotional hook deserves your attention. That can sound simple when written out. In real life, it is deeply difficult. Because many people have spent years equating immediate defense with self-respect. If someone accuses you falsely, of course you want to answer. If someone twists your motives, of course you want to clarify. If someone paints you in a way that feels unrecognizable, of course every cell in your body wants to stand up and say, that is not who I am. And yet, with someone like Daniel, repeated clarification often does not create understanding. It creates more openings. More language to twist. More emotional tone to analyze. More material to work with. More chances to move the focus away from his behavior and into Maya's response. This is why strategic responding often becomes shorter over time, not because the truth matters less, but because self-protection matters more. Maya learned to say less, not because she had nothing to say, but because she finally understood the cost of saying too much to the wrong person. She learned that brevity can be a boundary. That neutrality can be strength. That calm can be more disruptive to manipulation than passion ever was. And this is where many people misunderstand strategy. They assume it means being distant, dry, or icy. It does not have to. Real strategy can be warm in tone and still firm in structure. It can be polite without being porous. It can be clear without becoming emotionally available for exploitation. The goal is not to become lifeless. The goal is to stop making your inner life so accessible to someone who uses access without reverence. For Maya, this meant developing a new internal practice before difficult interactions. Sometimes it was as simple as taking one slow breath and silently asking herself, what is this moment really asking from me? Sometimes she would remind herself, just because something is provocative does not mean it is important. Sometimes she would decide in advance what she was and was not willing to discuss, so that she would not be making those decisions while emotionally flooded. That kind of preparation is not overthinking. It is emotional leadership. It is how you stay in relationship with yourself while interacting with someone who has trained you to abandon yourself quickly. And there is another layer here that matters deeply. Strategic responding does not only protect the conversation. It protects your identity. Every time Maya resisted the urge to over-explain, she was sending herself a message. I do not need to scramble for legitimacy. Every time she chose a measured response over a defensive monologue, she was reinforcing something even more important than the outcome of that one exchange. I can remain with myself under pressure. I do not have to dissolve just because someone else is distorting the room. That kind of strength is built slowly. Awkwardly, sometimes. Imperfectly, often. There were still moments when Maya reacted more than she wanted to. Moments when Daniel found the old bruise and pressed hard enough to get a visible response. Moments when she left the interaction frustrated with herself, wishing she had stayed steadier. But even that began to change, because she stopped measuring success by whether she never felt anything. She started measuring success by how quickly she could return to herself after being thrown off center. That is real progress. Not perfection. Recovery. Strategic responding also means accepting that sometimes your calm will irritate the narcissistic person more than your anger ever did. When the old doorways into your nervous system begin to close, they may knock harder. They may escalate. They may accuse you of being cold, detached, difficult, rude, or impossible. But those accusations often reveal something important. Your reactivity was serving a function for them, and now that function is no longer available in the same way. That is not failure. That is evidence that something is shifting. So if you are learning this skill now, be patient with yourself. This is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming less reachable by chaos. It is about slowing the moment down enough that your values can catch up to your pain. It is about recognizing that self-respect is not always loud. Sometimes it sounds like a shorter sentence. A delayed reply. A steady tone. A refusal to chase understanding where understanding is not truly being offered. And perhaps the most powerful part of all is this: when you start responding strategically instead of emotionally, you begin to feel your power in places where you used to feel only dread. Not because the other person changed, but because you did. Because now the interaction is no longer being led entirely by your wound. It is being guided, more and more, by your wisdom. Rule 3: do not argue with distortion, lies, or rewritten reality. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to defend reality against someone who keeps reshaping it while looking you in the eye. It is not the exhaustion of ordinary conflict. Ordinary conflict is painful, but it still lives inside a shared world. Two people may disagree, remember things differently, or struggle to communicate, yet there is still some common ground beneath the friction. There is still a basic sense that truth matters, that memory matters, that words mean something stable enough to return to. But when you are dealing with distortion, lies, and rewritten reality, you are no longer standing on common ground. You are standing on a floor that keeps moving under your feet while the other person acts as though you are the unstable one for noticing. That is why Rule 3 matters so deeply: do not argue with distortion, lies, or rewritten reality. At first, that rule can feel almost impossible. Because the instinct to correct falsehood is human. When someone says you meant something you never meant, your whole body wants to say, no, that is not true. When someone rewrites the conversation you just had, your mind immediately starts collecting details. When someone lies outright, especially about something that affects your dignity, your relationships, or your sanity, it feels natural to reach for evidence. You want the screenshot, the date, the exact quote, the timeline, the proof. Not because you are petty. Because you are trying to survive with your mind intact. That was one of the most painful parts of Maya's dynamic with Daniel. The emotional injury was bad enough, but the distortion afterward often cut deeper. It was not only that he could be dismissive, cold, or manipulative. It was that he could take an interaction that had just happened and somehow retell it in a way that left Maya staring at him in disbelief. He could shift emphasis, erase context, assign motives, flatten nuance, and produce a version of reality that protected him while quietly turning her into the problem. And if she challenged that version, he often became even more composed. That composure was part of what made it so maddening. Because people often assume that the calmer voice in the room is the more truthful one. But calm is not always innocence. Sometimes calm is simply control. Sometimes it is the confidence of someone who knows that if they stay smooth enough while you get increasingly distressed trying to defend the obvious, the room will start to tilt in their favor. Maya felt this most acutely in Chicago after one particular conversation that stayed with her for weeks. She had raised a reasonable concern, carefully and without accusation. Daniel listened, then slowly began to reposition the interaction. First, he subtly reframed her concern as hostility. Then he implied she had been carrying resentment she never expressed. Then he suggested her real issue was insecurity. By the end, he was no longer responding to what she had actually said. He was responding to a character he had created and placed in front of him, and somehow Maya was being asked to answer for that stranger. That is one of the most violating things about rewritten reality. It does not simply disagree with you. It replaces you. It takes your words, your intentions, your memories, and your emotional truth and runs them through someone else's agenda until you barely recognize yourself in the story being told. And that is exactly why arguing inside that distortion becomes so dangerous. Because once you step fully into the rewritten version to defend yourself, you are no longer standing in your reality. You are standing in theirs. You are answering accusations that were built on false premises. You are clarifying things that were never misunderstood in good faith. You are trying to win on a playing field designed to keep shifting. This is where so many people lose enormous amounts of emotional energy. They assume that if they can just explain clearly enough, prove precisely enough, or stay patient long enough, the other person will eventually have to concede reality. But in narcissistic dynamics, concession is often experienced as humiliation. Truth is not merely inconvenient. It is threatening. If reality exposes the crack in the grandiose self-image, then distortion becomes self-protection. The lie is no longer just a lie. It becomes scaffolding holding up an identity that cannot tolerate shame. That is why evidence so often fails in these interactions. Not because evidence has no value, but because the person receiving it is not evaluating it for truth alone. They are evaluating it for threat. Daniel did this repeatedly with Maya. The more clearly she remembered, the more suspicious he became of her memory. The more precisely she described what happened, the more he accused her of overanalyzing. If she pointed out a contradiction, he did not move toward accountability. He moved toward deflection. Her accuracy did not bring relief. It often brought escalation. This is the painful turning point many people reach, the moment they realize that being factually correct does not necessarily create emotional safety with someone committed to distortion. That realization is devastating at first. Because it means the old fantasy has to die. The fantasy that one day you will say it perfectly enough that reality will hold. The fantasy that one undeniable piece of proof will force honesty into the room. The fantasy that the right evidence, presented with enough calm and enough love, will finally make the manipulation stop. Sometimes it will not. Sometimes the more undeniable the truth becomes, the more aggressive the distortion becomes. And that can make you feel helpless unless you understand what the real task is. The real task is not always to get them to acknowledge reality. The real task is to stop abandoning your own. That is a completely different kind of strength. Maya began to understand this slowly. She started noticing that every time she entered long debates with Daniel about what was really said, what was really meant, or what had actually happened, she left feeling worse. Not because she was wrong, but because the interaction itself was built to exhaust her. It demanded that she spend huge emotional energy defending what she had already lived through, while Daniel spent comparatively little energy creating doubt. She was carrying the heavy burden of coherence. He was throwing smoke. And smoke is exhausting to fight with your bare hands. This is where the distinction between lying and gaslighting matters. A lie says, "That did not happen." Gaslighting goes further. It says, "And the fact that you think it happened says something troubling about you." A lie attacks the event. Gaslighting attacks your trust in your own perception. It is not just deception. It is destabilization. That is why survivors of these dynamics so often become obsessed with detail. Dates, screenshots, tone, sequence, memory. From the outside, that can look like overthinking. But often it is the mind's desperate attempt to preserve reality in an environment where reality keeps being tampered with. It is not madness. It is resistance. Still, there comes a point when preserving reality must become more important than debating it. That is where Rule 3 becomes not just wise, but life-saving. Do not argue with distortion, lies, or rewritten reality. Clarify once, if needed. Document privately, if necessary. Then step back. Because every time you refuse to chase distortion into its maze, you save a piece of your mind. This does not mean silence in every situation. There are times when facts matter legally, professionally, logistically, or relationally. There are times when a clear correction is necessary. There are times when documentation is essential. But clarity is different from entanglement. One sentence grounded in truth can protect you. 20 minutes spent trying to get a manipulative person to admit what they are doing can deplete you profoundly. Maya started practicing a new inner sentence when Daniel distorted something she knew to be true: I do not need to join this version of reality in order to survive it. That sentence changed her. It did not make the behavior less disturbing. It made her less recruitable. And that is the hidden danger in these dynamics: recruitment. Distortion is not just falsehood. It is an invitation into confusion. It asks you to leave your center and enter a manufactured world where you are always slightly wrong, slightly too sensitive, slightly misremembering, slightly overreacting, slightly responsible for what is being done to you. The longer you remain in that world, the more tired your spirit becomes. So one of the deepest acts of self-respect is this: stop treating every distortion as a doorway you must walk through. Some doors lead nowhere good. Some doors are not asking for discussion. They are asking for your disorientation. And you are allowed to protect yourself from that. You are allowed to say, internally or externally, this is not a good faith conversation. You are allowed to trust the pattern even when the words are slippery. You are allowed to let their lack of acknowledgement remain theirs. You are allowed to know what happened without begging the person who distorted it to certify your memory. That is not weakness. That is the rebuilding of self-trust. And self-trust is sacred after prolonged exposure to manipulation. Because once you begin trusting your own mind again, something beautiful starts to return. The frantic need to convince starts to loosen. The emotional urgency starts to settle. The hunger for their agreement begins to fade. Not all at once, but enough that you can feel the first breath of freedom. Maya did not become invulnerable. But she became less willing to spend herself trying to prove daylight to someone committed to closing the blinds. That changed the entire emotional architecture of the relationship. Because once you stop arguing with distortion, you start standing more firmly in truth. And truth, even when quiet, has a way of giving your soul back to you. Rule 4: protect your energy by limiting what you seek from them. There is a kind of peace that does not arrive when the other person changes. It arrives when you finally stop going to them for what they have never truly been able to give. That peace is rarely dramatic at first. It does not usually come with a grand speech, a slammed door, or some cinematic moment of liberation. More often, it begins as a quiet and painful realization. A realization that feels less like triumph and more like standing in the ruins of an expectation you carried for far too long. For Maya, that realization was not simply that Daniel could be cold, manipulative, or emotionally evasive. She had already seen enough to know that. What finally shifted something deeper in her was the understanding that much of her exhaustion was coming not only from what he did, but from what she kept reaching for. Again and again, she was going to the same person with the same invisible hunger, hoping that this time she would come away fed. Not always with something dramatic. Sometimes it was just a basic wish to be met with steadiness. To be answered in good faith. To feel that what mattered to her might matter to him because it mattered to her. To experience some small moment of emotional reciprocity that would reassure her that she was not living inside a one-way system. But that reassurance kept failing to arrive. And when it did seem to arrive, it was often partial, conditional, or so brief that it only renewed her hope enough to make the next disappointment cut deeper. This is why Rule 4 matters so much: protect your energy by limiting what you seek from them. At first, that can sound almost too simple. But in real life, it asks something enormous of the heart. It asks you to become honest not only about who the other person is, but about what part of you keeps returning to them with a cup they have repeatedly left empty. That honesty can be devastating. Because one of the most painful experiences in narcissistic dynamics is not merely being mistreated. It is discovering how long you have kept trying to turn a narrow source into a full one. How long you have kept taking someone's competence in one area as evidence of depth in another. How long you have confused flashes of usefulness with the presence of care. Daniel made that confusion easy. He was capable in ways that could easily mislead a hopeful person. He could be polished, articulate, composed under pressure, even impressive. He knew how to handle practical matters. He knew how to present himself convincingly. He could function well when the domain required efficiency, control, or image. From a distance, those qualities could look like strength. And for a long time, Maya unconsciously translated that strength into possibility. If he could be so competent here, maybe one day he would be capable there. If he could be so sharp, so attentive, so effective in certain settings, maybe the emotional failures were temporary, circumstantial, fixable. But competence is not the same thing as emotional capacity. A person may be highly functional and still be deeply limited in intimacy. A person may know how to perform care without knowing how to sustain it. A person may be excellent at managing outcomes while being incapable of handling another human being's vulnerability with tenderness. That is the heartbreak many people do not understand until they have spent years depleted. They are not always waiting for a monster to become kind. Sometimes they are waiting for a capable person to become whole. And that waiting can quietly consume a life. Maya began to feel the truth of this in small ways first. She would go to Daniel with a genuine emotional need and leave with less than she arrived with. Not always because he openly attacked her. Sometimes it was subtler. He would flatten the moment. Minimize the importance of what she was feeling. Offer something logistical when what she needed was attunement. Shift toward analysis when what she needed was care. Become uncomfortable the moment the conversation moved from function to feeling. That pattern taught her something she had resisted for a long time: just because someone can do a lot does not mean they can hold a lot. And that distinction changes everything. Because the real danger is not simply seeking from the wrong person. It is the slow self-abandonment that often comes with it. When you keep going to someone for something they cannot or will not give, you eventually begin adjusting yourself to survive the absence. You lower the need. You rename the wound. You tell yourself you are asking for too much. You become grateful for crumbs because admitting hunger would force a larger reckoning. That is how people end up emotionally starving in relationships that still contain enough moments of function to keep hope alive. This is where limiting what you seek from them becomes an act of profound self-respect. Not punishment. Not pettiness. Not emotional withdrawal for the sake of revenge. It is a recognition of limits. It is the moment you stop asking a locked room to become a home. For Maya, that meant learning to separate categories with painful clarity. Daniel could handle certain practical exchanges. He could respond to logistics. He could manage structure. He could sometimes show up well in domains that rewarded control, distance, and performance. But when it came to emotional nourishment, mutual reflection, repair, accountability, or the kind of warmth that makes a person feel safe in their own nervous system, the pattern was overwhelmingly clear. The more honestly she named those categories, the lighter she began to feel. Not happy. Not free yet. But lighter. Because she was no longer walking into the same wall while calling it faith. This is one of the deepest shifts a person can make in a narcissistic dynamic: to stop confusing proximity with access. Someone can be central in your life and still be emotionally unavailable. Someone can have authority, presence, importance, even usefulness, and still be the last place you should go for reassurance, comfort, or truth. The more clearly you see that, the less energy you waste trying to force nourishment from emotional stone. And that matters because energy is not infinite. Every attempt costs something. Every conversation in which you go seeking empathy and come back carrying confusion costs something. Every vulnerable moment you offer into a system that handles vulnerability poorly costs something. Every time you tell yourself, maybe this time, and the same pattern repeats, something in you gets a little more tired. So protecting your energy begins with inventory. Not a cold inventory. A compassionate one. What do I actually need? What has this person consistently shown they can provide? What am I still going to them for out of hope, habit, fear, loneliness, or the fantasy that one day they will become different? Those questions can bring a person to tears because they expose not only the other person's limitations, but the tenderness of one's own longing. And that longing deserves respect. Maya was not foolish for wanting more. She was human. She wanted to be met. She wanted to be loved in ways that felt mutual and real. She wanted the relationship to contain something emotionally alive. The tragedy was never that she wanted that. The tragedy was how long she kept looking for it in the wrong place. Once that truth settled in, Maya began to redirect her life. Not all at once, but deliberately. She became more careful about what kinds of conversations she had with Daniel. She stopped bringing her unguarded interior self into spaces where it was likely to be mishandled. She stopped making him the emotional reference point for experiences he did not know how to hold. She stopped treating his responses as the final verdict on her reality or worth. And slowly, she began sourcing elsewhere what she had been starving for. That is the part people sometimes forget. Limiting what you seek from the narcissistic person is only half the movement. The other half is allowing healthier sources to matter more. Maybe that means a trusted friend who listens without subtly rearranging your truth. Maybe it means therapy, where your inner world is treated as something worthy of care rather than something to manage. Maybe it means community, spiritual grounding, creative work, journaling, time in your own body, moments of beauty that remind you life is still larger than the emotional scarcity you have been living inside. The point is not merely to deprive the narcissistic dynamic of energy. The point is to return that energy to places where it can actually become life again. This is why the shift can feel so emotional. Because once you stop over-seeking from them, you are forced to grieve the fantasy that kept you tethered. You are forced to admit that some doors will never open the way you hoped. You are forced to let reality be smaller than your longing. And that is painful. But it is also clean. It ends a certain kind of internal war. Maya no longer had to spend every week wondering whether this would be the moment Daniel became emotionally safe. She no longer had to translate every small sign of competence into a promise of deeper care. She no longer had to keep bending her expectations just enough to survive the next disappointment. She could let the pattern speak more loudly than the potential. That is what protected her energy most of all. Not a new technique. Not a better argument. Reality, finally accepted. And once you begin living from that place, something almost miraculous happens. Your energy starts returning to you. The energy you used to spend preparing, hoping, recovering, deciphering, reinterpreting, excusing, and reaching begins to flow back into your own life. Into your own clarity. Into people who can reciprocate. Into choices that do not require you to betray your needs just to keep the peace. That is not a small change. It is the beginning of freedom. Because the moment you stop begging emotional nourishment from someone committed to scarcity, you are no longer just protecting your energy. You are protecting your future. What these 4 rules reveal: the relationship changes once you stop feeding it. Something startling begins to happen when you truly follow these 4 rules. Not all at once. Not dramatically, at least not at first. But steadily, unmistakably, the relationship begins to change. Or more accurately, the relationship begins to reveal what it has been all along. That is one of the hardest truths to accept when you start interacting differently with a narcissistic person. People often imagine that if they become calmer, more strategic, less reactive, less available for distortion, and more realistic about the other person's limits, the dynamic will slowly improve. Sometimes a few surface-level things do become quieter. Sometimes the volume drops for a while. But often, what changes first is not the narcissistic person's behavior. What changes first is your ability to see the behavior without the old fog wrapped around it. And that can feel shocking. Because for a long time, the relationship may have been held together not by trust, not by mutuality, not even by real repair, but by your participation in the cycle. Your explanations kept the conversation going. Your hope kept the bond emotionally charged. Your reactions kept feeding the machinery. Your longing kept you reaching back in after every injury. Your willingness to keep trying gave the dynamic movement, heat, and life. So when Maya stopped expecting fairness from Daniel, stopped reacting impulsively, stopped debating every distortion, and stopped seeking emotional nourishment from a place that had repeatedly left her emptier, something subtle but profound happened. The old rhythm was interrupted. And when the rhythm of a narcissistic dynamic is interrupted, the structure often becomes easier to see. That is not always comforting. In fact, it can be devastating. Because many people discover that once they stop feeding the pattern, there is far less relationship there than they have been telling themselves. There may still be contact. There may still be logistics, routines, appearances, roles, obligations, and moments of polished normalcy. But underneath all that, something becomes painfully visible. Much of what felt like connection was actually sustained by your emotional labor. Your effort to explain. Your effort to calm. Your effort to smooth things over. Your effort to bring meaning, depth, patience, and humanity into a system that kept converting those gifts into leverage. That realization can hit like grief. Not because you are weak. Because you are finally seeing without cushioning. Maya felt this most intensely after she had been practicing these rules for a while in Chicago. She noticed that once she stopped chasing Daniel into every emotional storm, the storms changed shape. They did not disappear. But they stopped feeling like complicated mysteries she needed to solve. Instead, they began to look more like patterns. Predictable. Repetitive. Mechanical, almost. If she remained calm, he sometimes grew sharper. If she did not defend herself, he sometimes pushed harder. If she did not take the bait often became more obvious. That can be a deeply unsettling stage. Because part of you wants to believe that healthier behavior on your side should inspire healthier behavior on theirs. That is how decent relationships work. One person regulates, the other follows. One person lowers the temperature, the other gradually softens. One person becomes more grounded, and the relationship slowly becomes safer. But narcissistic dynamics often operate differently. When your reactivity has been serving a function, your calm can feel like a threat. When your confusion has been useful, your clarity can feel like defiance. When your longing has been keeping the emotional system open, your detachment can feel like betrayal. So yes, sometimes it gets more obvious before it gets easier. And that is where many people panic. They think, maybe I am doing this wrong. Maybe being calmer is making things worse. Maybe pulling back emotionally is cruel. Maybe not explaining is unfair. Maybe I should go back to how I used to handle it. But what if the escalation is not proof that your boundaries are failing? What if it is proof that the old supply line is no longer working the same way? That was the question Maya had to learn to hold. Because once she began changing her side of the pattern, Daniel's responses became strangely revealing. He did not always become louder in a theatrical sense. Sometimes he became colder. More cutting. More dismissive. Sometimes there was a subtle increase in contempt, as though her new steadiness was depriving him of something he had once taken for granted. It was not always explosive. Often it was quieter than that. But it carried a certain edge, a certain irritation, a certain pressure that made one thing unmistakably clear: her old emotional availability had been useful to him. That realization is heartbreaking, because it forces a deeper question to the surface. If your pain, your over-explaining, your defensiveness, and your hope were all helping keep the relationship emotionally alive, then what exactly was the relationship resting on? That is not an easy question. It can open an entire chamber of grief. Grief for what you thought this was. Grief for the meaning you tried to build around behavior that kept contradicting your hopes. Grief for the years spent believing that if you just found the right tone, the right boundary, the right evidence, the right amount of patience, the right amount of love, the relationship could finally settle into something real. But there is another side to that grief, and it matters. Because once the truth begins to reveal itself, it also begins to liberate. Maya started noticing that her body was telling her the truth faster than her mind could explain it. Before seeing Daniel, there was heaviness. After certain conversations, there was fog. Sometimes she would leave an interaction that seemed outwardly uneventful and still feel deeply depleted. That used to confuse her. She would tell herself, nothing major even happened. Why do I feel like this? But now she understood something she had not trusted before: the body often recognizes emotional danger long before the mind is willing to name it. The dread before the meeting, the hollow feeling afterward, the tension in the neck, the exhaustion that arrives after a conversation that looked fine on the outside, these are not random overreactions. They are often messages. Signals. Evidence from the nervous system that something in the interaction is fundamentally unsafe, even if the surface remains controlled. This is part of what these 4 rules reveal. They do not only change the dynamic. They expose the cost of the dynamic. They show you how much of your life has been spent bracing, anticipating, recovering, and translating. They reveal how much effort went into making something unworkable feel workable. And that revelation can feel almost holy in its own painful way. Because once you see clearly, you cannot fully unsee. That does not mean the next step is immediately obvious. Sometimes people still have to stay for a while. Because of children, work, finances, family structures, or timing. Reality is complicated. But even when circumstances do not change overnight, perception can. And perception is powerful. Once Maya saw the pattern more clearly, she stopped personalizing every turn of it in the same way. Not because it hurt less in every moment, but because it made more sense. The dynamic no longer felt like an endless puzzle she had failed to solve. It felt like a system revealing its own nature. And that matters, because self-blame starts to weaken when pattern recognition gets stronger. You begin to realize that your effort was not failing to fix something healthy. It was being absorbed by something unhealthy. There is a world of difference between those 2 truths. One makes you feel defective. The other makes you feel awake. And awakening, even when painful, is often the first real movement toward freedom. This is also the stage where loneliness can intensify. That needs to be said honestly. Because once you stop feeding the relationship in the old ways, you may find yourself standing face to face with how little true reciprocity was there. The emotional noise may decrease, but the emptiness becomes harder to deny. The role you used to play may become less automatic. The bond may feel thinner, stranger, more mechanical. You may feel sadness not only for what was done to you, but for how much of your love was spent keeping alive something that could not love you back in the same way. That sadness is not weakness. It is the emotional cost of waking up. But even here, there is dignity. Because what these 4 rules ultimately reveal is not just who the narcissistic person is. They reveal what has been happening to you. They reveal where your energy has been going. They reveal how hope can become a tether. They reveal how reactivity can become a resource for the other person. They reveal how often your own goodness was used to keep you engaged in a cycle that diminished you. And once that revelation settles in, something begins to shift at the level that matters most. You stop asking, how do I keep this relationship alive at any cost? And you begin asking, what is this relationship costing my life? That question changes everything. Because from there, you are no longer simply surviving the dynamic. You are studying it from the outside instead of drowning in it from within. You are no longer measuring success by whether the other person approves of your response. You are measuring it by whether you are becoming more intact, more self-trusting, more awake, more honest about what is real. That is the hidden power of these 4 rules. They do not just help you manage a narcissistic person. They help you see the relationship without the illusion that once kept you trapped inside it. And sometimes, seeing clearly is the beginning of getting free. Your life is bigger than this: healing, rebuilding, and returning to yourself. There comes a point in healing when the question is no longer, how do I manage this person better? The question becomes, how do I stop organizing my life around what this person does to me? That is a sacred turning point. Because surviving narcissistic dynamics can become its own kind of identity if you are not careful. You get so used to watching the temperature of the room, measuring your words, reading expressions, anticipating shifts, recovering from conversations, and trying to preserve your inner balance after another emotional bruise that you can slowly forget something essential. Your life was never meant to become a full-time response to someone else's dysfunction. And yet, that is what often happens. A person like Maya does not wake up one day and choose a life of hypervigilance. It happens gradually. Quietly. So quietly, in fact, that by the time she realizes how much of herself she has been sacrificing, the pattern already feels normal. She has learned how to brace before Daniel speaks. She has learned how to replay conversations long after they end. She has learned how to hold 2 realities at once, the polished version outsiders might see, and the invisible emotional toll she carries alone. She has learned how to function while hurting, how to keep moving while confused, how to keep showing up even when some part of her spirit feels worn thin. That is why the final rule is not really a rule in the same sense as the others. It is something larger. It is an invitation back into your own life. Because no matter how skilled you become at navigating a narcissistic person, that cannot be the end goal. The end goal is not to become excellent at enduring emotional distortion. It is not to become so strategic, so disciplined, so self-protective that you can survive indefinitely in an atmosphere that keeps draining you. Survival matters, of course. It matters deeply. But survival is only the bridge. It is not the destination. The deeper destination is return. Return to your own mind. Return to your own body. Return to your own values. Return to your own ability to know what is true without needing it endlessly confirmed by someone committed to confusion. Return to the version of you that existed before every conversation became a subtle battlefield. That return can be one of the most emotional experiences of a person's life because it asks you to reclaim what was never fully destroyed, only buried under adaptation. For Maya, healing did not begin with one huge breakthrough. It began with small acts of reunion. She began noticing the moments when she felt most like herself and the moments when she felt least like herself. That alone was powerful. For so long, her focus had been outward. What is Daniel doing? What does he mean by that? Why did that conversation turn again? Is he lying? Is he projecting? Is he baiting? Is this going to get worse? But healing shifted the center of gravity. The question became quieter and far more important: what is happening inside me? That question changed everything. Because once she started asking it honestly, she could no longer ignore how much of her life had been organized around managing the impact of someone else's instability. She noticed how often she abandoned her own rhythms to accommodate emotional chaos. She noticed how rarely she felt fully relaxed in her own body after contact with Daniel. She noticed how much creative energy had been diverted into self-protection. She noticed that even silence had become loaded, as though peace itself had to be earned rather than inhabited. That awareness was painful, but it was also deeply clarifying. It showed her that healing was going to require more than understanding narcissism. It was going to require rebuilding a life that did not revolve around it. And that is where real recovery begins. Not merely with insight, but with reconstruction. Rebuilding after narcissistic harm is not always glamorous. Sometimes it is heartbreakingly simple. It can begin with telling the truth in a journal after years of minimizing. It can begin with writing down what happened before the old self-doubt returns and starts sanding down the sharp edges of reality. It can begin with one sentence written in the quiet, "I am not imagining the toll this has taken on me." That sentence can be revolutionary for someone who has spent years overriding their own instincts. Maya also began creating what might look small from the outside but felt enormous inside. She made room for rituals that returned her to herself after difficult interactions. She stopped pretending that emotionally corrosive moments could just be absorbed and ignored. She would step outside after contact with Daniel and let the cold Chicago air hit her face. She would walk without music for 10 minutes and let her thoughts settle instead of immediately diving back into analysis. She would place a hand over her chest and ask herself a question so simple it almost felt fragile: what do I need right now that has nothing to do with him? That question became a doorway. Because healing often begins the moment your needs stop disappearing behind your reactions. Maybe what she needed was water and quiet. Maybe she needed to call someone emotionally safe. Maybe she needed to hear her own voice again in a room where nothing was being twisted. Maybe she needed beauty. That part matters more than many people realize. When you have lived too long in emotionally manipulative dynamics, beauty can feel strangely medicinal. Not because it erases pain, but because it reminds you that your inner world is still capable of responding to something other than threat. A patch of winter sunlight across a kitchen table. The sound of footsteps along the lake in Chicago. A bookstore. A warm drink held with both hands. A familiar street at dusk. These moments are not trivial. They are reminders. They tell the nervous system that life still contains gentleness, and gentleness is not weakness. It is restoration. Healing also meant that Maya had to rebuild trust in herself, and that may be one of the hardest forms of rebuilding there is. Narcissistic dynamics do not only wound through cruelty. They wound through repetition. Through subtle contradiction. Through enough confusion, blame, and emotional inversion that you begin to mistrust your own read on what is happening. So recovery requires more than distance from the person. It requires intimacy with yourself. That means relearning the language of your own inner signals. The heaviness that arrives before certain interactions. The exhaustion that follows certain kinds of contact. The peace you feel in spaces where no one is trying to manage your perception. The small flash of relief when you realize you do not have to explain yourself to be safe. These are not minor things. They are pieces of your self-trust returning. And self-trust, once rebuilt, changes the entire architecture of your life. Because when you trust yourself again, you stop negotiating as deeply with what harms you. You stop calling your intuition dramatic. You stop treating your pain like an inconvenience. You stop needing everyone else to agree before you honor what your body already knows. This does not make you hard. It makes you anchored. That anchor matters because healing is not only about reducing harm. It is also about relearning joy. This can be surprisingly difficult for people who have spent a long time in survival mode. They know how to analyze, predict, brace, and endure. Joy can feel unfamiliar, even unsafe at first. Rest can feel suspicious. Lightness can feel undeserved. There is often a quiet guilt that surfaces when life begins to feel easier, as though easing out of pain is somehow disloyal to everything you carried. But joy is not betrayal. Joy is evidence that the soul is still alive. For Maya, this meant deliberately giving attention to what made her feel expansive rather than contracted. She began returning to things that had nothing to do with Daniel and everything to do with being herself. Reading not to escape, but to feel mentally awake again. Long walks by the water not to process conflict, but to remember that the world was wider than the emotional room she had been living in. Music that did not hold memory, but possibility. Meals eaten slowly. Evenings not spent decoding someone else's behavior. Laughter that did not come with tension attached to it. These choices may sound ordinary. They are not ordinary when you have been disappearing inside your own life. They are acts of reclamation. Healing also asks for community, because returning to yourself is easier when you are no longer surrounded only by dynamics that distort you. You need places where your reality is not up for debate. You need people who do not feed on your confusion. You need relationships in which calm is not a weapon, honesty is not punished, and care does not come with hidden invoices attached to it. That can mean friendship, therapy, support groups, family members who are capable of emotional steadiness, a spiritual community, a creative circle. Any space where your nervous system gets to experience something simple and revolutionary, mutuality. Mutuality is deeply healing because it restores proportion. It reminds you that not every difficult feeling needs to become a court case. Not every vulnerability will be used against you. Not every disagreement must end with someone dominating the emotional climate. When you begin spending time in relationships that are reciprocal, the old dysfunction becomes easier to recognize for what it is. Not because you are now seeing through theory, but because you are finally feeling the difference in your body. This is how a life starts becoming bigger than the narcissistic dynamic. Not because the past disappears, but because it stops being the axis around which everything turns. The person who once occupied your mental landscape so completely begins to shrink in scale. Their moods stop determining your weather quite so much. Their distortions stop reaching all the way into your self-concept. Their reactions stop carrying the authority they once had. They do not necessarily become harmless, but they become less central. That is a form of freedom. And freedom often arrives quietly. Not with one loud declaration, but with 1,000 subtle shifts. The first time you do not replay the conversation all night. The first time you believe your body sooner than their words. The first time you choose rest over rumination. The first time you tell the truth to someone safe and hear yourself clearly. The first time you realize an entire day has passed without emotionally orbiting Daniel. Those moments matter. They are not small. They are the architecture of a new life. So if you are at the stage where all of this still feels far away, hear this gently: healing does not begin when you are no longer affected. Healing begins when you stop abandoning yourself for the sake of managing what affects you. It begins when your own inner life becomes worthy of your protection. It begins when peace stops feeling selfish and starts feeling necessary. It begins when you understand that your life is too precious to remain a constant reaction to someone else's unhealed patterns. Maya did not find healing by finally getting Daniel to understand the harm he caused. She found healing by understanding that her future could no longer depend on his understanding. That was the shift. That was the liberation. The moment she stopped waiting for the person causing the confusion to become the source of clarity, she began stepping into a different kind of life. A life with more truth. More space. More steadiness. More room for softness without danger. More room for love that does not have to be extracted. More room to be fully herself without bracing for the cost. That life is possible. Not because pain was imaginary. Not because the damage was small. But because the self is astonishingly capable of return when it is finally treated with care. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all: you do not heal by becoming less human. You heal by becoming more fully, more honestly, more protectively, more tenderly yourself. Your life is bigger than this. It always was. And the moment you begin living as though that is true, healing is already underway. Maya's story is not really the story of one woman and one difficult man. It is the story of what happens when a sincere, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent person keeps trying to build a healthy bridge towards someone who is more invested in control than connection. At the beginning, Maya believed what so many people believe, that pain inside a relationship can be solved with enough honesty, patience, self-reflection, and love. She thought that if she stayed calm enough, fair enough, clear enough, and compassionate enough, Daniel would eventually meet her in that space. But over time, the truth became impossible to ignore. The problem was not simply miscommunication. The problem was that she was approaching the relationship as if both people were seeking truth, while Daniel was often seeking emotional advantage. That realization changed everything. Her healing did not begin when Daniel apologized. It did not begin when he finally understood her pain. It did not begin when he suddenly became emotionally safe. It began when Maya stopped measuring the relationship by her intentions and started seeing it through its patterns. She learned that expecting emotional fairness from someone who survives by controlling the emotional climate will only deepen confusion. She learned that reacting from pain may feel natural, but strategy protects peace better than emotional urgency ever can. She learned that arguing with distortion drains the soul because manipulation is not solved by better evidence alone. And perhaps most powerfully, she learned that one of the greatest acts of self-respect is to stop seeking nourishment from someone who has repeatedly shown you their limits. That is the deepest lesson in this story. Clarity is painful, but it is also merciful. It hurts to accept that someone may never give you what your heart has been asking for. It hurts to let go of the fantasy that one more honest conversation will finally unlock empathy, accountability, or tenderness. But it hurts even more to spend years standing at the same closed door, knocking with your whole heart, and calling the silence hope. Maya's growth came when she understood that survival was not the final goal. The true goal was returning to herself. Returning to her own nervous system, her own truth, her own dignity, and her own future. She stopped organizing her life around Daniel's moods, distortions, and limitations, and started rebuilding a life where her energy could belong to things that actually gave life back. For the audience, the application is deeply personal and deeply practical. This story asks you to look honestly at your own life. Where are you still waiting for fairness from someone who has shown you a pattern of control? Where are you still over-explaining to a person committed to misunderstanding you? Where are you still starving emotionally because you keep going to the wrong source for care? And most importantly, what would begin to change if you believe that your peace deserves protection now, not someday? In real life, this may look like shorter conversations, firmer boundaries, less explaining, more documentation, more trust in your body, and more investment in relationships that feel mutual and emotionally safe. Healing is not only about understanding narcissistic dynamics. It is about choosing, again and again, not to lose yourself inside them. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace professional diagnosis, therapy, or treatment from a licensed mental health professional. Here is a quick question for you. What do you think is the hardest step in breaking free from a narcissistic dynamic? A. Accepting that they may never change. B. Learning to stop losing yourself while they stay the same. Comment A or B below. And I'd really love to hear your perspective too. Which part of Maya's story hit you the hardest, and what lesson do you think people most need to hear right now? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from each other's experience. And if this kind of content speaks to you, subscribe to the channel to support it and help keep more powerful, healing conversations coming.